Can the power of friendship help me win locals? Let's talk about it. What's up, captains? Welcome back to the other decks. My name is Casual Dobo, and today we're going to be talking about the deck that I use to win the first few locals of OP02 in my local game store scene. So a little bit of backstory to that opening. I was only able to get one box of OP02, which honestly I'm very fortunate to be able to get a box because it's been really difficult to get a hold of. But honestly, did not have enough pieces really to build a deck at a time, but wanted to go to the first locals, support the scene, do my thing, hang out with friends, essentially. And so I was like, hey, does anyone have any cards I could borrow? And through like bits and pieces, I didn't even build like the full like Wano Supernovas version of Kid, but I had a Kid deck. I could almost build it. I just needed a couple pieces, ask a couple friends, hey, can I borrow this? Can I borrow this? And ultimately built a Kinemon deck kind of on the fly. And honestly, it was pretty good. I liked it a lot. It doesn't fit my traditional playstyle, but it did show me the power that is Kinemon. And while I did, end up picking up a couple more pieces here and there to build the second version of it, this is essentially the main bones of what I had built for both of these events. And honestly, it's pretty fun. So, wanted to share this list with you for this deck profile and would love to hear your thoughts on it. Now, before we get started, I do want to mention that I'm going to be doing this in my sort of old school way of doing deck profiles, where we do the Dawn curve and kind of just show everything as is. But, if you've noticed over the last couple that I posted, I've actually been trying to experiment, see how I want to present some of these deck profiles to do it in a somewhat more sort of educational way, I would say, presenting information and then the list afterwards. I would love to hear your thoughts as to which format of deck profiles you like better. Do you like something that we saw in the Zoro and Smoker deck profiles, or do you like this one? Let me know in, honestly, the comments of any of those videos. But without further ado, let's go ahead and hop into the deck profile. Alright, and starting us off like we do with all of our deck profiles, we're going to start off with the Dawn curve. So this one is a bit lower to the ground, kind of playing more in the 2 cost, 3 cost range, and that's mostly because, at least for our 3 costs, we're able to use Kinemon's leader ability to cheat them out for a little bit cheaper. And we sort of balance out this sort of lower to the ground curve by having a couple good spikes in our 7 and 8 cost areas. And then in terms of our counters, working with 18 1k counters, 8 2k counters, which honestly is a little bit low for me, but ultimately that's kind of what I had to work with. And then 4 counter event cards. But kind of what we make up for in our lack of counter power, we make up for it entirely in our number of blockers, which we do have 11 in here. And honestly, the Kinemon deck kind of has a lot of on-play abilities that can help control your opponent's board, and that's really the name of the game when it comes to this deck. So if I was doing it in the new style, I'd say that the essentials are really those cards that you can play out for cheap and things that can kind of control your opponent's board. But with the Dawn curve out of the way, let's go ahead and actually jump into the deck profile. Alright, and starting us off with our leader, it's Mono Green Kinemon, 5,000 power, 5 life, so your typical monocolored leader, but activate main once per turn. When you have 1 or less characters in play, reduce the play cost of the next cost 3 or higher Wano country type character card you play from your hand by 1 during this turn. So essentially, and this is the famous Kinemon play, if you go second, so you have 2 Dawn, and you have Okiku in hand, normally 3 costs to play, but when you use Kinemon's leader ability, it now becomes 2 because you have 0 cards in play. So you can get a turn 1 Okiku, and Okiku is very nice because it does not have a low power. It has 5,000 power, so it's kind of protected from the typical counterplay Vista. And really, this effect doesn't have to be used with just Okiku. You can use it for your Yamatos or your Kazuki Odins, which we'll talk about later in a bit. Next up, pretty important, is going to be your Kazuki Momonosuke, aka Momo. 1 cost to play, 0 power, counter plus 1k, but activate main 1, so rest the Dawn. You can rest this character to look at the 5 cards from the top of your deck, reveal 1 Wano country type card, and add it to your hand. Then place the rest at the bottom of your deck in any order. So this is a searcher, and if you've seen anything from the sort of top tier competitive meta decks, you kind of need a searcher in order to be, competitive, because that adds a level of consistency to your deck. And this is good because it can search for all of the key essential Wano country stuff we need: Okiku, Raizo, Yamato, Odin, etc. So yeah, Momo is an instantaneous 4 copies, but he is not the only searcher we have in this deck. So we do have 3 copies of Jewelry Bonnie. If you played an OP01, you pretty much know already. 1 cost to play, 1000 power, counter plus 1k. Essentially, rest 1, does the same thing, look at top 5, reveal Supernova, add to your hand, bottom deck the rest. And this is good to find some of the other top end Supernovas that we insert in this deck, namely our Useless Captain Kids. Next up, 3 copies of Killer. I think he's just a solid blocker, is searchable by Jewelry Bonnie. 2 cost to play, 2000 power, counter plus 1k, is a blocker, but Dawn times 1 on block if you control 3 or more characters, which you probably should with Kinemon and with such a low to the ground Dawn curve. But if you have 3 or more characters, draw 1 on block. So this is really good to just give you a little bit more card advantage, as well as to protect yourself from incoming attacks. Mostly have him at 3 just to make space for some of the other top end cards that I would definitely prefer to see. Next up, 2 copies of Nekomamushi, aka Cat Viper. This is the OP01 version, so 2 cost to play, 3000 power, counter plus 1k, but on play, rest up to one of your opponent's characters with a cost of 3 or less. So once again, this adds to that sort of board control nature of this deck, and allows you to tap down some pretty problematic things, especially if you're going into the sort of red Zoro matchup and your opponent is trying to set up their board with a bunch of 1 costs. Play some Nekomamushi, tap down that attacker, and then just try and swing to clear their board. But honestly, Cat Viper is a little bit debatable in this deck, so that is why he's a 2 of. But I do sort of like him as a cheaper alternative without having to use my Kinemon leader ability. Next up is 4 copies of Scratchman Apu. Honestly, he's just a 2k counter for me in here. I don't really use his ability, but is 2 costs to play, 3000 power, and a 2k counter. Speaking of 2k counters, we do have 4 copies of Izo, so 3 costs to play, 3000 power, counter plus 2k, but has a really awesome on-play ability, rests up to one of your opponent's characters with a cost of 4 or less. So this one can help target some more problematic characters on your opponent's board, and is able to be reduced in its cost by Kinemon's leader ability, because Izo is Wano country. Next up, 3 copies of Raizo, 3 costs to play, 4000 power, counter plus 1k, but when attacking, once per turn, if you have 2 or more arrested characters, draw 1. Similar to our inclusion of Killer in this just allows us to get a little bit more draw power, while also potentially being able to swing into our opponent's leader. You still have to attach a Dawn onto it to make it viable, but still, it can do it. Next up, and I think this is honestly pretty crucial, 4 copies of OP02 Nekomamushi, aka Cat Viper. 3 costs to play, 4000 power, and is a blocker. Because it is Wano country, it can be reduced to 2 costs with the Kinemon ability, and because it is 4k, it's actually really nice because it is just outside the range of Vista's, Nico Robin's. So against red, it is pretty solid. Now against like black and purple and other green decks, it's not as useful. I mean, it's still useful, but those effects usually target cost, and it is still a 3 cost, so it can get tapped down, it can get blown up by a who's who, it can easily be reduced and knocked out with a Kobe in black. So it still has some weaknesses, but since red is still pretty dominant in the meta, I think this is a really good call to put into any of your green decks. Next up, the star of the show, 4 copies of Okiku, 3 costs to play, 5000 power, but Dawn times 1 when attacking, once per turn. Rest one of your opponent's characters with a cost of 5 or less. So a little bit slow in the sense that it has to, be on the board, wait a turn, and then attack in order to use its effect. But its effect is really, really good. And like I said, if you manage to put him out with the Kinemon effect on turn 2, essentially, or turn 1, where you have 2 Dawn, that is great value that you have. And then if you happen to put down another Okiku, that is a lot of control that you have for the early game, where you can really sort of outpace, out-tempo your opponent. So 4 copies of this, really important. Almost as important as 4 copies of Yamato. So Yamato is from OP02, 4 costs to play, 6000 power, so an absolute powerhouse. But this card's name is also treated as Kazuki Odin, which is important for if you're running the other Kazuki Toki, if you're running Toki in your deck. I do not. So I'm really using this for its on playability. Rest up to one of your opponent's characters with a cost of 6 or less, which is a pretty crazy ability for 4 cost, which can be played for 3 costs thanks to Kinemon. But once again, the name of the game is controlling your opponent's board, and nothing does it better than Yamato. And the fact that it is a natural attacker even into Whitebeard is absolutely perfect. Next up, we do have 3 copies of X-Drake, 5 costs to play, 6,000 power, counter plus 1k, but on play, KO up to one of your opponent's rested characters with a cost of 4 or less. So if you combine this with your Yamatos, your Okikus, even your Izos or your Nekomamushis, X-Drake can KO any of those characters that those cards are able to rest. And so once again, it is good value to eliminate something on your opponent's board while also putting down a 6k attacker onto your field. And then rounding our characters, we do have our suite of super rares. So first up, we have 4 copies of Blocker Eustace Captain Kidd. So 7 cost to play, 7,000 power, has no counter potential, but it does have the blocker keyword, and then Dawn times 1 at the end of your turn. You can set this card as active. So essentially, when it's viable to attack, you can attach a Dawn onto it, swing for 8k into your opponent, whatever you want to do, whether it's a character or your opponent's leader, and then at the end of your turn, just rest it back as active, and now you have a viable blocker. And yeah, 7 cost Kidd is just a great wall to kind of defend against the potential onslaught of your opponent's attacks. Especially from cheap stuff like Zoro. Speaking of walls, we do have the best wall that came out of OP01 at 8 cost Kidd. So 8 cost to play, 8,000 power, no counter. So Dawn times 1 on your opponent's turn. If this character is rested, your opponent cannot attack any other card other than characters named Eustace Captain Kidd. So essentially, they have to get through this Kidd first before they can get to Kinemon. And I've seen a couple of deck profiles put this as a 1 cost just sort of to tech it in. I do like it as a 2 just because with the searchers you should be able to see it, but sometimes there's mishaps like how I played it at my last locals. Luckily I recovered, but I used the Bonnie ability and found Odin, and then I used the Momo ability and found Kidd out of that. So I had to bottom deck everything I was looking for. So sometimes luck of the draw can play out that way. But Eustace Captain Kidd is fantastic against Zoro in my opinion, because your opponent has to put in a lot of resources to put up their characters to even hit 8,000. Sure, they can do that with their Zoro leader, but if you manage to defend against that particular attack, what are the other 1 cost characters going to do? You need to boost them up by like 5 Dawn attached onto them. It's kind of crazy. So yeah, the reason for 2 is mostly so I can for sure see him, especially in the Zoro matchup. And the last character in here is 2 copies of Kazuki Odin. 8 cost to play, 8,000 power, and this is really where the offense of the deck comes in. Activate main once per turn 3, so rest 3 Dawn in your cost area. Switch this card to active. So if you enjoyed playing Kidd and swing for 12k into your opponent's leader twice, now you can do it in character form. Sure, does that make it a little bit more vulnerable to the counter attack, your opponent swinging big into it? Yes, but it does have an on KO ability, play up to one of your Wano country type characters with a cost of 3 from your deck, then shuffle your deck. So this is cool because you can play a blocker Nekomamushi. You can play Okiku, who can then start controlling the board on the next turn it comes to you. And not only that, but you get the ability to shuffle your deck. And if you heard me talk about Sentomaru when I was talking about the blue starter decks, that is a very powerful ability, and honestly a rare one in green. And then if you attach some Dawn onto Kazuki Odin, you're able to boost up that attack and then swing twice with it. Very good offensive card. Alright, and then last but not least, we do have 4 copies of Punk Gibson. This is our 2 cost to play counter event. Your leader or up to one of your characters gains 4,000 power for the duration of the battle, then rest one of your opponent's characters that costs 4 or less. So once again, really solid, especially in the Zoro matchup when they have a bunch of low-costed characters that can potentially swing into you. This is really good to use to rest one of them, can't attack with that thing anymore, and then also gain plus 4,000 power on defense. And then it also has a really cool trigger ability, rest one of your opponent's characters. But anyway, that is it. That is my Kinemon deck profile for OP02. Let me know in the comments below what you think about it. What would you add? What would you take out? I know that I've seen a couple people really play around with Hawkins, play around with some other law blockers, right? And I think the top end is really where you can kind of play around and customize this. But I do think that the base of this deck, the core essentially, should revolve around your Okikus, your Yamatos, your Momonosuke's, and your blocker Cat Vipers. But yeah, anyway, let me know how you're building your Kinemon decks. Would love to hear you. And if you enjoyed the video, if you liked the content, please be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, as we're going to be doing more OP02 content. We're going to be releasing an Ivankov deck. Our Garp deck is going to be coming out as soon as I figure out, lock it down. And we're going to be doing a lot more deck profiles. And overall, just do some more One Piece card game content. And if you want to check out this preview of the OP04 meta, some of the leaders that were leaked and revealed, be sure to click this video here. Anyway, I think that'll do it for me. So thank you so much for watching. Really appreciate it. And captains, remember, build what you like, play what you love, and I'll catch you in the next video.